Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining. We'll have a few more people trickling in as we always do, a few minutes late. But welcome to the August event in our Scholars Library session. So we do this each month and it allows a scholar to come back and talk about their literary works to those within the Rhodes community and also beyond that. And for this session, I'm really excited to welcome Jennifer to talk about her poetry and more specifically her new chapbook called Dubious Breath. As I was saying earlier, this is the first of these sessions we've got on poetry, so that's very exciting to me as well. Zehra is going to moderate the session. She's a writer and a poet herself. Her poems have won awards and she's written and edited for various publications internationally. She's got a master's in migration studies and also social anthropology, and is currently working on her first book as well. So I won't spend too much time talking, but I will post the link to Jennifer's chapbook in the chat. But now I'll hand over to Zehra, who will give you a further introduction to Jennifer, the session, and we can get right into it. If you've got any questions as you go, please post them in the chat or feel free to wait to the audience Q&A session afterwards and we can fit them in there. So over to you, Zehra.
Thank you so much, Georgie, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm really excited to have this conversation with Jennifer about her recently published chapbook of poems. So what we'll do is, as Georgie mentioned, I'll give a quick introduction of Jennifer and then we'll have a reading and then have a discussion between the two of us and open it up for question and answers. So a little bit about Jennifer. Jennifer is a professor of English literature at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, where she specializes in British Romanticism. She's the author of a scholarly monograph, Blake and the City, and Dubious Breath is her second chapbook of poems. The first, Let Me Let Go, appeared from Finishing Line Press in 2020. Her poems have appeared in such journals as Oxford Poetry, Southern Poetry Review, Think, and Quarterly West. You can also purchase Dubious Breath from, I think Georgie will share some information for how you can purchase the book. And just a little bit of an introduction to the chapbook. I'll read out the blurb. Framed by the claustrophobic experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, these poems share a concern with the fragility of the earth and our bodies on the earth, as well as the webs we weave through virtual means of connection. Michael draws on biblical and mythological allusions as well as personal anecdotes in both formal and free verse to chart the porous boundaries of our current world and to create a space for mutual dwelling with all the risks entailed in that cohabitation. So as I was mentioning to Jennifer earlier, I really appreciated reading this chapbook. The poems are powerful and they very powerfully and beautifully explore and capture sort of the fraught experiences and emotions that so many of us have had during this pandemic and in the early days during the lockdowns as well. And I think there are a lot of the chapbook, I found it really beautifully explores a lot of questions and concerns that many of us had. And before sort of passing it on to Jennifer to do a reading for us, I wanted to share a brief excerpt from a review, which I think does a very good job of capturing the chapbook. Jennifer Davis Michael's powerful collection of poems, Dubious Breath, chronicles the life of one poet during the COVID-19 pandemic. Crouched, cramped with loved ones, inhaling each other's dubious breath, the poet sees the world with an uncomfortable clarity, one where aching eyes long for the blur. With that, Jennifer, I'd love for you to take it over and give us a reading.
Thank you so much, Zehra and Georgie and everyone who has tuned in. I recognize some friends and family in the audience, and I appreciate your interest in these poems. I do have a few poems to read, and I'll start with the first poem in the collection, which I suppose fittingly enough was published in Oxford Poetry, a journal that I would pick up at Blackwell's back in the day, and didn't really imagine that I would one day be in it. It's called And in Those Last Days. The sky was brilliant blue, implausible, as on a postcard from a former time. Trees shuffled all the paint store chips of green. Even the clouds less cloudy, more concrete, and all of it delineated so sharply, as when the oculist holds up a lens a smidge too strong and asks if 1 or 2's the view that you prefer. Seduced by clarity, you opt for 1, but later long with aching eyes for the blur. This was the sharpness just before the end, light shimmering as if brushed on by Vermeer, the paint about to crack under the weight before the lines began to run like watercolor. Some of the poems in the collection are not about COVID, but about other kinds of medical anxiety. This one's called Augury. Today, my friend awaits the doctor's call, a reading of the cells that hold his fate. I stand beside the bluff, scanning for signs. Wet sandstone, golden in the fickle light, turns dark as blood in shadow. On my left, a mockingbird sings on the branch, shifting its melody every few bars. Over the valley, 2 hawks in counter circles swoop in and out of mist, then disappear. The bird falls silent, but still holds its perch. Lacking the ancient art of augury, I bend to pull a wet leaf from my shoe. No, not a leaf, a feather. Holding it, declaring it a sign, I turn toward home. Enchantment is one that I think Zehra wants me to talk about a little bit later. It's for my nephew, born during the pandemic. Welcome to your crib, as safe and unenchanted as a plain pine wardrobe full of empty coats. Your parents will lift you to the spiny branches, let you taste snow. The fist outside your swaddle grasps an invisible tail. One day you'll touch the soft place in the wall, a seam with loosened threads. You'll slip to a foreign shore where strangely you are known. You will protest the prophecies and mourn, I'm not the one. Even the lady with a torch is not at liberty to put it down. Break bread with the dragon, dance with the wild things. Somehow you'll know the hour to ride home on a selkie's back. Shaking off the foam and seaweed, you'll find this world unmasked, with lips and teeth discovered, ears open as a shell to hear the story only you can sing. Pandemic questionnaire. Have you experienced loss of smell or taste? No, but I can smell sour worry on my breath, stagnation in too many days of undone laundry. Yes, and I can taste the bitter of stale coffee, news pounding like a toothache, the cheese gone slightly off. But I can't even touch my father in his bed. Instead, I hold my phone, a window on his room, a screen where I appear as ghostly as the figures on his TV or voices bellowing from the hall. And when I kill the screen and take my eyes for a walk, the smallest leaf or insect can pin me where I stand, listening to the songs of wren and mourning dove. When friends pass by, I wave, palming the empty air. During the pandemic, I also have found myself reflecting on the more severe experiences of confinement that others have had. And this was prompted by an interview I heard on the radio. The title is Dead Air. Steve Inskeep interviews a Chinese-American woman whose husband, a doctoral student in Persian history, is mysteriously detained in Iran. 300 marks on the wall, hieroglyphs of hopeless time. One daily hour of natural light, a tricolored flag shadowing the high-walled concrete yard. The prisoners pace in circles, losing count. Even when the phone line is pristine, her loved one is a million miles away, vanished, detained, forced to confess. He cannot make a sentence, cannot pronounce his sentence, its duration twice his young son's age. The reporter asks the not quite widow, what was his voice like? Allowing dead air to hang like the delay in a lagging phone connection. He cannot make a sentence, she says. He was just crying. For a costly moment, the reporter lets her silence be his silence. And listening in my car, I hold my breath, their tears, our silences. This one's called Physical. My doctor shines a light into my ears and sees a waxen tyrant's words congeal. My doctor hears my alveoli tweet the latest deals on Amazon and Etsy. My doctor finds inside my nose the scent of human traffic, sweatshops, pepper spray. My doctor's stethoscope against my chest hears bullets puncturing a classroom door. My doctor has me read a foggy chart, the letters melting faster than the ice. My doctor says my reflexes are slow to kick a leering bully in the groin. My doctor looks between my legs and finds a garden of contaminated fruit. My doctor draws some blood and says, "You're fine." I think the last one I'll read is called Pentecost. The images are tired. Both sacred wind and fire seem incongruous at best to us who've seen the worst of power on display. When virus-laden breath rhymes perfectly with death, how dare we even pray for holy inspiration? Our very respiration is further compromised by gas and pepper spray. And if the rhyme of dove with love is too predictable, a world that's sterilized of spirit is unbearable. I think I'll stop there and see what Zehra has to say.
Thank you so much for that reading, Jennifer. It's always wonderful to actually hear the poet read their work as opposed to just reading it on the page. So I think that gave me sort of even another insight into these poems. I was wondering, maybe we could, for our discussion, just sort of start right at the beginning about your journey with poetry. I read on your I think on your website. So you teach and you study romantic poetry, but you've written somewhere that it's only recently that you spent more time on your own poetry. And I'd love to sort of hear a little bit more about that, what that journey has been like for you, and when did you start writing poetry?
Well, there are really two answers to the question. One is, when did I start, and when did I get serious about it? I suppose I was really fascinated with language from the minute I could talk. And my mother says I started reading by the time I was 2. Writing soon followed. And I went to college thinking I wanted to be a writer, but I think I thought more in sort of a journalistic way. And in college, the study of literature for its own sake really took hold of me, and I went down that academic track, the PhD, and fortunately a tenure track position teaching English literature. And I thought I would continue to write poetry on the side, which I did, but not very consistently. So it was about 7 years ago when I took a workshop at the Sewanee Writers Conference, which is right here under my nose, and I've sort of haunted the periphery of it for years. But I finally applied to and enrolled in a workshop with Charles Martin and Alicia Stallings, and they really encouraged me to start submitting poems for publication, and that encouraged me to see poetry not just as a hobby, but something to really commit myself to.
That really resonates with me, because I think a lot of creative writers often do find themselves in academia, often studying literature, studying writing, while at the same time wanting to balance their own creative writing, their own poetry. And I think that's certainly like a tension I've noticed among many writers. But I guess that workshop kind of brought you back into sort of exploring your own writing. Was was there, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, go ahead. I'm waiting for the next.
And I guess I'm curious about what about this particular moment, or for this particular collection, how you sort of got to it, and what your creative process was for this collection. I think during the pandemic, with the lockdowns, a lot of people found it difficult. Some people found it difficult to be creative or productive or to write or do, and others actually found found themselves having a lot more time to pay attention and focus on their creativity, or using, writing or art as a way of processing a lot of the things that were sort of happening around them. And with the lockdown as sort of like a chance to sort of go inwards. So I guess I'm curious about what your process was like with this particular collection. How did it come to be? When did you sort of start writing the poems? Did you know that you were writing towards a collection, or did it sort of come together and you sort of realized that there's a collection here? So just sort of the story of this particular collection.
Yeah, thanks. And just for those who may not know, a chapbook is simply a short collection of poems, usually under 30 pages or so, and usually organized around some theme. And I didn't set out to write a set of poems about the pandemic. But like so many of us, that's where my mind was, and everything I wrote during that time was suffused with this. And it is surprising to me that I was able to write when I know so many writers who really couldn't. And like so many of us, my life was upended in many ways. Professionally, I found myself teaching on Zoom. The family is all suddenly in one space, doing their school and work in the same space. But I think that poetry became a way for me to deal with it in some ways. And it was toward the fall of 2020 that I realized I had a number of poems that explicitly or implicitly related to the pandemic. Some of them had been composed beforehand, but related in broad terms to this moment. And once I had that in mind, it was a matter of selecting which ones really fit, which order they should go in, as well as polishing the individual poems. And I had help from two great poet friends, I should say, Jessica Jacobs and Leanne Couch, in that editing process and in the ordering process, which is as important as the composition process, particularly in a collection of this length, where the order and the shape of it really does matter, because it's got to be so tight.
That's really true. With the chapbook, you kind of, if you have a theme, you're sort of telling a story almost. And I'm curious, how did you think about the ordering of the chapbook? How did you approach it?
Yeah, there again, it was Leanne Couch that helped me a lot with that. But the first poem, and in those last days, really it is kind of, the before times, as we often call it. And then the final poem, which is called "And Then," picks up also on some days, that there are some days where something of that clarity returns, or is present. And part of that is to avoid ending the book on a completely down note, because as you've noticed, some of the poems are pretty down. But one thing that working with Leanne has helped me see is that, I tend to be somewhat literal and think I have to put the poems in the order in which I wrote them, or in the order in which things happened. But there are other ways of organizing that make connections using particular words or images or themes. So a narrative arc is one way to put the book together, but there are other ways having to do with patterns, with repetition, with juxtaposition, and things like that. So again, for me, it really helps to have a good reader to help do that, because I think, as with any kind of art, often the maker is so close to it that it's hard to get that perspective.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, and I think this is actually really helpful to hear. But because I guess sort of you mentioned that there were some poems that you wrote before the pandemic, and they were sort of a different moment. So sometimes, as the poet, is sort of the obvious choice where you feel, okay, this is this particular moment, these are these series of poems, and then this is sort of that, and this is the pandemic, and sort of like a chronological sort of approach. So it helps to have a reader to kind of help see that actually there are a lot of themes or different images and different ways of sort of bringing these poems together. I guess I have also am wondering what particularly about your experience of the pandemic or this particular moment in time that you think was sort of lens, or rather, how can you sort of maybe discuss how the experience, what's your experience been like exploring the pandemic through verse, and what does the poetic form in particular offer to you to sort of explore this moment?
Yeah, thanks. And I could answer that really in two parts. One about poetry in general, and then about formal verse, if that's okay. For me as a writer, poetry is just the way I engage my experience, right? Both mentally and emotionally, and finding the right word or the right juxtaposition of words or images is tremendously satisfying in a way that it's hard to really explain. Maybe it gives a sense of control amid the chaos. It's like things click for me when I can do that. But it's also about communication. I don't just write for myself. Early in the pandemic, I came across a blog by, let's see, I wrote her name down, Alicia Jo Rabins, called Bathtub Pandemic Poems. Some of you may have seen these. One of them was about how the symptoms of anxiety resembled the symptoms of COVID. So it became a sort of feedback loop, and that reflected my own experience, and I'm sure many others as well. And I think in that time when so many of us felt isolated and anxious, encountering writing that could connect us with others through words in that way could be liberating and even healing. But I also want to say something about specific form in poetry. And any poetry has a form, I think, even if it's free verse. Someone's deciding where to break a line, right? And the sounds have form, and the sounds form patterns. But But you may have noticed, I'm sure you did, that some of the poems are more formal than others in their use of meter and rhyme. And for me, a poem finds its own form. Maybe it wants to be a sonnet or a villanelle, or it doesn't. I remember a couple of years ago trying really hard to write a villanelle that turned out it didn't want to be a villanelle. It ended up being something else. But once I've determined the form or accepted what the form is going to be, then the constraint becomes its own kind of challenge. And I believe, as a number of other poets have said, that the form can be a useful container for strong emotion, right? The difficulty can really help the mind to focus when you might feel like you're kind of coming unglued, and there can be a comfort in the predictability of a form too, just as in the predictability of rituals surrounding death. And even though at the height of COVID, of course, so many of those rituals were cruelly denied. This did not happen to me, but people close to me had losses in their families that just could not be processed in the normal way. And just another thing about the relationship of form here. Another thing about COVID, I think, is that it so disrupted our calendars, our sense of space. I've already mentioned, the whole family doing their school and work in the same room sometimes, and also just the mundane rituals that we're used to. So again, that's a place in which I think the structure of poetry can maybe fill a need. And I guess I'm speaking not just from my perspective as a poet, but also a reader, a consumer, if you will, of poetry. Sorry, that went on a little long.
No, that was beautiful, actually. I think to compare form as a sort of almost as a ritual, as giving you sort of the framework to explore something, but kind of giving you that, grounding you in a way. I think that's really beautiful. What do you mean by as a reader as well? Do you mean like as a reader, poet, like as a critic? Like, what do you mean by?
Well, both. I mean, I read with my scholarly lens, and then but I also just read as a person. And I don't know, it's not always easy to separate those things, Yeah. I find myself turning to some poems that I think, oh, I really want to teach this poem because I can kind of take it apart and all that, and then others that I just read because they just fill some psychological need for me. And then there are both. Obviously, there are some that fit both categories.
Mm-hmm. Would you say when you're writing poetry, you're also sort of writing as a reader of poetry?
Yeah, I mean, there's that kind of double awareness. Although I try when I'm actually doing the writing to turn off the critic, if that makes sense, because the critic can really get in your way. But definitely when I'm going back to read what I've written, to revise, I try to step back, and I think that's true with any art. You have to throw yourself into it and then pull back. And I'll be interested later if there are other writers and artists in the audience that want to share their experience with that, because I do think there are those moments. There's a phrase that gets bandied about in creative writing workshops. It's "kill your darlings," which I think is sort of terrible in itself, but it's you have to be able to be ruthless when you're editing, and but you have to produce those darlings, if you will, beforehand. If you're already thinking about killing them, they're not going to come out. I don't know, this metaphor has gotten out of control. I'm going to stop it.
No, that makes sense. I think you have to allow yourself to write and kind of silence the critic actually, in order to give yourself freedom to write, and not self-doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, another relationship that you sort of explore in these poems is to physical space and place. You know, there's all these shifts in we look at like moments you're sort of observing, and the pandemic did kind of make us really aware of our surroundings in a particular way. So there's the neighborhood, the noise and images of the news on the television, and there's sort of in your poems there's this awareness of both the world out there and everyone sort of going through this experience, but also this kind of cramped claustrophobia of lockdown, sort of in like these really tight, cramped spaces. I think you write cramped closets and bathtubs. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this. I'm curious about what the physical spaces were that you were occupying as you wrote those poems, and how sort of what your relationship was to that.
Yeah, you know, some of the neighborhood poems actually predate the pandemic, but the pandemic threw, as you said, it threw so many things into relief, into sharper focus. And, you know, as I've said, you know, like many others, I've found myself having to renegotiate that boundary between work and family, and distance being strange, you know, working in close proximity to family, but not the colleagues or students that I'm working with. And so Zoom becomes its own space, you know, like right here, right now. And, you know, before the pandemic, I wouldn't have, you know, thought of doing something like this. I think I had used Zoom a couple of times for meetings and found it very unsatisfactory. And it has opened up some worldwide spaces that I hadn't realized existed. But then for me, there were particular circumstances that exacerbated the spatial extremes. There's a poem about a tornado warning where we had to take shelter in a small bathroom. So that was sort of a lockdown within a lockdown. And the tornado did not cause damage here, but it did not far away. And so that was sort of like a disaster within a disaster. And at a time when, for most people here in rural Tennessee, you know, COVID hadn't really made much of an impact. But then, you know, here was this tornado that did. My father's confined in a nursing home. We couldn't visit him for about 15 months. We were fortunate to be able to communicate by video call, but that's its own, you know, strange space as we've all experienced. And unlike people in some places, I was fortunate to live in a place where outdoor walking was not restricted at all. So that became very much a daily practice. And at the same time, being in nature really underscored for me the sense of climate crisis that we're all in too. You know, whether or not that's directly related to, you know, to the pandemic, to the, you know, appearance of this new virus, there's just a sense of our fragility, you know, on this earth that that comes out, I think in a lot of the poems. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. It reminds me of I think there was this essay that Arundhati Roy, a writer, wrote around that time, where she described the pandemic as a portal, as a kind of sort of opening and view into all these sort of different things. You mentioned again the word clarity, and that's something that sort of comes up in your first poem and throughout, this image of both solidity and sort of porosity and clarity and blurring, and I'm curious about if you could say a little bit more about that, like I think you talk about was it in your first poem at the end, like wanting the blur after like sort of this sharp clarity. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Again, that's the sort of thing that becomes clear or became clear later as I'm trying to put the poems together, that, you know, sometimes we don't notice that, you know, we keep writing about the same thing, right? And it's related to the role of the human body, I think, in in the poems. You know, to what extent are we solid beings, and how much are we porous? Are we, you know, vaporish? Vaporish is a good Keatsian word. You know, then there's Hamlet, you know, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt. Or is it sullied? That's always a textual question. But going back, in terms of my own poetry, back when I was working on my PhD, I noticed that I wrote very cerebral poems, full of explanation, and not unlike the writing that, you know, that I had to do for my degree. And over time, I've tried to bring the poetry back down to earth, grounding it more in the body. And a few things have helped with that. One thing is I've developed practices of meditation and mindfulness that where I try to be fully present to what is happening in the moment, rather than you know, spinning off into thoughts. And I've also done a number of poetry exercises. I'm going to, if I may, plug someone else's book. Nicole Brown and Jessica Jacobs have a wonderful book called Write It, and there's an exclamation point, write it. And a lot of exercises that involve the senses, or maybe envisioning the room you're in at a different time, or imagining that you're a dog, or writing about a part of your body that doesn't please you. And the full-length collection that I am working on now is tentatively titled Bodies at Rest, where I'm hoping to develop this theme of embodied presence. That's sort of a remote way of answering your question about, you know, blurring and clarity. But I think it's a way to get at it, because sometimes blurring is not a bad thing, because we, you know, to some extent, as the mystics would say, our separation from one another is an illusion, right? And again, I think that the porousness of those connections in a time of pandemic, I mean, it's frightening. You know, we can't, we can't say, oh, I'm here and you're there, and what happens to you doesn't affect me, because it's that's very much not the case.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, because in some ways it both poetry brings us and makes us more attuned to the body, to the senses, but then also you're writing poetry about the pandemic, which is, or some of the poems are about, and which is also a moment of us becoming particularly attuned to our bodies in a particular way, and also sort of the how we're sort of all connected, and that kind of how the porousness of sort of body. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. Sorry, were you saying something?
No, I'm just I'm being an animated listener. I've learned that on Zoom, that's a nice thing to do. Right?
Yeah. I'm also, you mentioned the mystics, and I'm curious about, there are quite a few moments when you bring in mythological and biblical allusions in your poem. And I'm also struck by the last two lines, I think, in your poem Pentecost, which you read for us. A world that's sterilized, spirit is unbearable. Maybe could you share a little bit about how mythology and faith traditions, what they offer to you as a poet, and both as a poet and as a person living in this particular moment?
Sure, thanks. Well, first, on a personal level, I am a practicing Christian in the Anglican tradition. My husband is a priest. So the practice of communal worship is important to me. And that was in many ways interrupted by the pandemic, as many churches had to curtail the practice, particularly the practice of sharing in the Eucharist every week. And a couple of the poems also reflect on, or at least allude to, the murder of George Floyd, and the meaning, if any, of his death as a sacrifice that might lead to greater awakening. Can we see him as a martyr without in any way justifying that death. That was one of the things I found myself wrestling with. In terms of poetry, thanks to my education, which Oxford plays a big part in, I have a really rich tradition to draw from in terms of stories that make sense of whatever's going on. Someone has encountered it before in some way, and the image that kept coming up for me, and it's in several of the poems, is this idea of embracing the air, and in a number of classical poems, particularly in Homer and Virgil, there's a journey to the underworld called a catabasis, in which the hero, he goes to the underworld, it is a he in these examples, and receives some kind of prophetic knowledge that will help him on his quest. But in the process, he also encounters people from his own past, and there's usually an attempt to embrace this shade, who then vanishes, and it's usually 3 times, right? 3 times Odysseus tries to embrace his mother, for instance, and she evaporates into air. And I would sort of air hug friends at a distance, particularly during those early months of the pandemic, when we didn't have a vaccine, we didn't know, how vulnerable we were, even, outside, outdoors. There really was this sense that we can't have that kind of contact. And I think that it can sort of, shifting into allusion in that way can be a way of deflecting from one's own feelings. In fact, one of my helpful readers kind of warned me about that, saying, don't fall back on your literary knowledge here. Tell us what's going on with you. But at the same time, I think if we only talk about what's going on with ourselves, we can lose the sense of universality that I happen to think these literary antecedents help to convey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was struck by, I think it was in Fog in the Stone. That was, is that the poem you're referring to?
Yeah.
I just also want to, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand if anyone in the audience has questions, or put them in the chat. I have one more question for you, Jennifer.
Okay.
Oh, Peter has a question. Maybe we'll just take that question. Go ahead, Peter.
Great to see you, and thanks. That's one of the things of Zoom. Yes, I like your poem with Augury, and I particularly was thinking about the roots of watching for birds and wondering what they're trying to tell you. And so that's so I enjoyed that. And did you find yourself watching nature for pleasure, or were you probably weren't actually wondering what the mockingbirds were trying to tell you, but did you connect with nature in a different way during the pandemic? So.
Thanks, Peter. It's good to see you too. I don't know if I consciously did, but I think that, as in that poem, we find ourselves, at least I find myself, looking for signs, even if I'm not conscious of doing it in the moment, so that poem itself, actually, it predates the pandemic, but it's a time when a friend was undergoing a health crisis. And, I did find myself sort of looking for signs, even though I know that that's not a scientific practice, that, it's the doctor that's going to tell us. It's not whether this thing stuck to my shoe as a leaf or a feather, but we do, we look for these signs, even if they're not literal. And I think that's, where the arts maybe complement the sciences in some way. There's this sort of search for meaning that maybe is beyond, what the biopsy is going to say. I don't know how well that answers your question.
Thanks, that's good.
Great, thank you.
give a minute if anyone else have any questions? Okay, I have another question for you, Jennifer. Actually, I was wondering if you did read the poem Enchantment,
Yeah.
and I'm again in your poem there are all these moments of both of different type. You have birth and you have birth and death, and there's just so much sort of both like a sense of future and past. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that poem, and also I think in the poem there's a line where you talk about a soft place in the wall. Maybe if you could read just those lines around that poem and tell us a little bit more about what you meant there.
Sure. I'm sorry, I'm
Well, that's okay.
finding my place again. Yeah, one day you'll touch the soft place in the wall, a seam with loosened threads. You'll slip to a foreign shore where strangely you are known. You will protest the prophecies and mourn, I'm not the one. Even the lady with a torch is not at liberty to put it down. So, so the story behind this poem, my brother and his wife found out that they were expecting their first child just as the pandemic was hitting New York City, where they live. And as you can imagine, that made the whole experience even more isolating and anxious for them. They pretty much hunkered down in their apartment. They had everything delivered. At first, my brother couldn't even go with his wife to the doctor appointments. She sent him he heard the sound of the heartbeat through the first ultrasound via her cell phone. Thankfully, he was able to be there for the birth itself. And I ended up writing the poem for the baby. His name is Llewellyn. For Christmas when he was about 6 weeks old. And I was trying to get at several things. As you noted, the touching the soft place in the wall and kind of coming out of confinement. Of course, birth is a coming out of confinement. But then I was just thinking about how he was born into what was still a very confined space. And at a time when, we didn't know, when would they feel like they could, really take him out in public and that kind of thing. And I also bring in a lot of the children's literature and folklore that I'm excited for him to discover. There are allusions to Narnia. There's Maurice Sendak, Where the Wild Things Are, and so on. And also the idea of slipping between worlds, which is so common in fantasy, and finding that in some other world you're a character in a story that you don't even know. And the Narnia books, which I was reading with my own son during that first year of the pandemic, really bring that up too. These children show up in Narnia, and people bow down before them, and what is this? And the lady with a torch, of course, that's Lady Liberty in New York Harbor. But there's also the sense that mythic idea of prophecy intersects with family lore too. The story, you're a character in your family story, and this child was a long-awaited child, both of his parents being over 40. So I was trying to pull all that together in the poem. So it's a private poem, but I thought it was worth sharing with other people. I hope it works.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I found it's a quite striking poem. So thank you for sharing the story behind it.
Sure.
Yeah, if anyone else has questions, please feel free to raise your hand. There's another poem I'm actually curious about. It is Why I Am Not Writing a Poem.
Yeah.
And I was on, it's a short poem, so maybe you can read it, maybe share a little bit about what's going on in this poem.
Sure. Again, I have to find it. You'd think I'd be more familiar with my own book.
It's page 12.
Well, thank you so much. Why I'm not writing a poem. The cat sits in the window looking out. My throat is scratchy, sinuses a throb. Geraniums dance in sunlight on the deck. The washing machine upstairs shifts into spin. I let my eyes unfocus, look at nothing. The cat lies down across my writing arm. A car passes the house, heading toward town. So, of course, the title is sort of a tease, why I'm not writing a poem, but of course I am. This is a poem. I guess it's sort of playing with the idea of, when we're doing nothing, we're still doing something, maybe. It seemed to fit the COVID moment, even though I have not, knock on wood, had COVID, but, there's a moment when, my throat's scratchy, maybe I do. But it's also, this is a moment when, I'm feeling I should be doing something. What I'm doing is sort of recording what's going on around me. And each line, you may not be able to tell from the way I was reading it, but each line is its own sentence. And just a series of declarative sentences, which normally I might think, well, this is kind of boring, I want to mix it up. But in the case of this poem, it seemed to work because it's descriptive, and yet implicitly, maybe more than that. The cat and I are both looking out, watching the, very little that is actually happening outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for reading that. Yeah, you also have in that sort of sentence, I let my eyes unfocus, look at nothing. So again, sort of that focus and blurring and image in there.
Since I'm very nearsighted, so maybe that's part of why I keep talking about that.
Literal.
Yes, I'm lost without these,
Yeah. Yeah. Was there any other poem in particular that you wanted to share with us?
Yeah, let me see what I haven't shared that might be good. Maybe I'll read that final poem because it is one that leaves us perhaps on a hopeful note. It's called And Then. And then there are days when the air is so mild, the current so gentle, it holds you benevolent, like a lover's hand on your back, a child's trusting grasp. It holds the birthday candles, the IV drip, the pink slip, the rogue cells, the unmade bed, the blackened eye. It holds. In this still moving, everything is held. It is weather and more than weather, and it is very good.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess we have a few more minutes. And if anybody, again, has questions, please feel free to jump in.
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
No quizzes. No quizzes will be given. No grades.
Yeah.
Peter.
Sorry if I'm usually shy, but that at the end of this, I was interested where you're talking about form. Do you think more that you make poems or you receive poems? It's some of both probably, but what are you thinking for yourself there? Yeah.
Wow. Well, as a scholar of romanticism, I'm probably supposed to say that I receive them because that's the very romantic idea that, inspiration just, inhabits the poet. I think it's a back and forth process, really, because I think that part of it is putting myself where poems can find me. So being attentive, receptive, which sometimes means, sitting out, staring out the window with the cat. But once an idea is there, sometimes I really do have to sort of wrestle it into shape, if that makes sense. So I would say it's a two-way process. Having said that, I mean, I have great respect for people who, and William Stafford did this. I have a friend named Jeff Harden who does this, who just get up every morning and write a poem, and whether they feel inspired or not. And I'm trying to work toward that in myself, because I think that's a good practice. It doesn't mean that it has to be a good poem, but you're putting something on the page, as opposed to waiting for inspiration to strike, which it may never do that. So yeah, I think it's definitely both parts of it, Peter.
We have a comment. It's not a question, but I wanted to say that I really enjoyed the sense of space and time in your poems. They have such a self-evident atmosphere.
Thank you, Pema.
Yeah. So what's the process, if you don't mind sharing?
Sure.
I know it's sometimes not so great to talk about a current work in progress, but what's sort of that process been like for you right now for your new project?
I'm really just so I'm on sabbatical this academic year, thankfully, and one of my projects is to work on this book, and I have a number of poems already. I mean, including some from this chapbook and the chapbook before, that I think play with these ideas of embodiment, but also contemplative practice, and what it means to be still, or as I said in that the final poem in the collection, in the still moving, everything is held. What can poetry do to help us be aware of whatever we want to call it, higher power, sense of harmony in the universe, that holds despite all. Michael has his hand up.
Oh, well, if you're through, I wasn't trying to interrupt you or rush, but I just love that line, the lady with the torch is not at liberty to put it down. I love that. I mean, I think I was like, I'm riding in the car and listen to that, and it just grabbed my attention and won't let go. The resident, I love lines like that. Don't mind saying, I wish I'd written that, but it calls, liberty is a abstraction, but then it becomes so visceral there and becomes, proactive there. What is, she can't put it down, and if she did, what would happen? But then that she can't put it down is, it's like an allegory being encaptured. It speaks to me of allegories, how strong they are, how captivating they can be. Maybe that's why they've been with us a long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Stronger than the iron that she's made of.
Thank you. I'm glad it resonated with you, and I think you've made more of it than even occurred to me at the time, which is great. I think often people think, well, it has to be exactly what the poet intended and no more, no less. And I would hate for it to be limited to whatever might have been passing through my mind at the time, because I think the reader then takes it into their world, and I'm so glad that it resonated with you and inspired you.
I wouldn't be surprised if it resonated with other people also. It's just that kind of line.
Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you.
My
so
pleasure.
Much.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for reading and sharing your process. And I really enjoyed this conversation. We are at time, and so thank you for everyone who's joined. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you, especially Zehra, and thank you to Georgie for setting this up, and thanks to all who tuned in. I think this is a wonderful thing that Rhodes House is offering. So I look forward to tuning in to other sessions.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer.